Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inquirer Live at Gameday Central alongside EJ Smith. I am Olivia Reiner. We are coming at you live from New Orleans, getting set for the Eagles matchup against the New Orleans Saints. EJ, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Olivia. New Orleans is one of my favorite cities on the NFL circuit. The great food, great atmosphere. I'm excited to check this stadium off my list of NFL stadiums that I've covered a game in. So, yeah, I'm excited for the show, and I'm excited for the game.
We're excited to bring all of you along with us. If you are not already over there, head on over to inquirer.com/Eagles Game Day. You can leave us a comment, a question during the show. We will answer some of those questions during our fan zone portion. And if not, during the game, we'll also be over there too. So we'll get to some of your questions. We'll get in there. I'll be in the chat answering some of your questions during the game. So we look forward to seeing you over there. All right, EJ, we have a lot to discuss today in terms of who's playing, who is not playing. As we already knew going into today's game, A.J. Brown, once again, is not active. He is still dealing with a hamstring injury. He did not practice all week, didn't play last week against the Atlanta Falcons, and now the Eagles will be down their star receiver once more. So that's, a big loss. We'll touch on a little bit later in today's show about who we might think might step up in his place and what the Eagles' game plan might be, particularly in the passing game. But as we knew already, A.J. Brown not playing. Devin White remains a healthy scratch. The Eagles' inside linebacker, the big offseason addition, continues to not be able to get on the field, which I think if you told us to start training camp would be the case, would be quite a bit of a shock. EJ, what does Devin White need to do to get on the field at this point?
I think he's going to just need to bide his time at this point. You mentioned it. Like, he was the starter throughout training camp. I don't think he had a bad camp per se. I just think that Nakobe Dean had a better camp. So I think at this point, Nick Sirianni's talked about how they're going to need him at some point during the season. I mean, Zach Bond and Nakobe Dean has missed time throughout his career. I do think that it's going to be a matter of just being patient. It is worth noting that he's talked the last 2 weeks. He doesn't seem, he seems frustrated that he's not playing, but he doesn't seem like he wants to, kind of like cause any trouble or anything like that. So I think that he is just kind of in a wait and see mode. I think it makes, like I said last week, I think it makes sense that he is a healthy scratch if he's not going to be a part of the defensive game plan because he doesn't play special teams, and that is usually what you want from your down the depth chart linebackers. So I think it makes sense that he's a healthy scratch. What does he have to do? I think it's going to be hard at this point. I mean, the Eagles had, 2 practices last week. So I think it's really just going to be a matter of being patient.
So not only is Devin White, A.J. Brown inactive, we've also got the rest of the inactives here. No real surprises. Tanner McKee, of course, the third quarterback, inactive. Eli Ricks, once again, inactive. Darian Kennard, Trevor Keegan, and Byron Young, which means Jalix Hunt is once again active, especially after Patrick Johnson was waived prior to last week's game. Hunt now moves up in the lineup and is able to get on the field, contribute in a special teams role. What is also notable is that C.J. Gardner-Johnson is active. He popped up on the injury report with a foot injury. He did not practice on Thursday, on Friday, and was listed as questionable to play going into today's game. However, he was out on the field before practice. Didn't even really look like he was working with a trainer or being evaluated. Typically, Howie Roseman will be watching on. He was just out there with the rest of his teammates, with the secondary, going through some drills before the team drills and stretches. So good news there for the Eagles with Gardner-Johnson. How do you think the secondary will fare with Gardner-Johnson in the lineup going up against this really potent Saints passing game?
Yeah, I mean, you said it. Like, this Saints passing game is one of the best in the NFL through 2 games. I think that's an important qualifier. I don't think many people expected that much from the Saints going into the season, but if you look at their first 2 games, like, they have been one of the most dominant teams in the league. So, whether or not that keeps up, I think is going to be interesting to monitor both today and throughout the season. But in terms of how the secondary is going to shape up, I mean, the Saints have been a very explosive passing game. Rashid Shaheed is, he's been a prolific punt returner in his career, and now he's kind of translating that into the offense. And it kind of feels like every game, once or twice a game, they just kind of throw it up and hope that he gets underneath one of those deep passes from Derek Carr. I mean, he's had, we can talk more about it later, but he's had deep catches in each of the first 2 games of the season. So I think that when you talk about that, that's what makes me wonder about where C.J. Gardner-Johnson is at in terms of health, because they're going to need their safeties to, keep the lid on the defense per se. It's a foundational principle of Vic Fangio's scheme is to limit explosive plays. This offense has been very explosive through 2 games. So that's going to be one of the keys to the game for sure.
We'll see if CJ is on a snap count as he makes his quote-unquote homecoming. He used to play for the Saints here. Also, I think worth noting here on the other side for the Saints, Taysom Hill is inactive with a chest injury. He was listed, I believe, going into this game as doubtful, or at least he was downgraded to doubtful yesterday. So Saints officially rule him out. This man wears a lot of hats in the Saints offense. He can do just about everything. I don't know if PFF still lists him as a quarterback, but he also has sort of like a tight end role as well. Without Hill at their disposal in the offense, how do you think the Eagles might be able to benefit?
Yeah, especially late in the week. We talked about that with AJ Brown last week, losing a player later in the week. I think it does have an impact. I mean, if you look at the way that they use him, it's so unique. There's not another player that can really wear all of the hats, as you said. He's the Swiss Army knife for this offense. He can kind of, they have gadget plays for him. And they have, I feel like parts of their play sheet are dedicated to the fact that Taysom Hill can do so many different things. And, they can sort of like play off of certain looks that he is a part of. So, it probably will be a little bit of a limiting factor. I think it's kind of funny, I feel like Taysom Hill, to talk a lot about him being out. It's like, this guy's been around the league for a long time and kind of isn't like one of the headline names of this offense, but he is an important part. Like you said, he does so much for them. There's always the odd trick play where Taysom Hill can throw the ball down the field. So I do think that they probably will have a little bit of their play sheet, cut off because of Taysom Hill's absence, but it's still a really high powered offense, as I'm sure we'll talk about later.
He wears a lot of hats. Maybe the right term is he wears a lot of helmets, but whatever you want to call it, it's certainly not good for the Saints and perhaps something that the Eagles will benefit from in the game. In addition to all of these, the roster decisions and inactives and everything like that, the Eagles have a pair of practice squad elevations. Tight end Jack Stoll has been called up. Wide receiver Paris Campbell for a second straight week has also been elevated. EJ Jenkins is not active this week. EJ, I believe that means you are the top EJ available in this game.
I guess I'm available. I don't think they'd want my contributions today.
Available as present, I should say. How about that? All right, Let's transition into our latest headlines segment. The Eagles are coming off of a really tough loss, as we already mentioned, to the Atlanta Falcons last week. I think it was particularly defined by that 6-play, 70-yard touchdown drive that the Falcons rattled off toward the end of the game with less than 2 minutes remaining. All facets in the wake of this game of the defense have been scrutinized, and particularly the pass rush. Rightfully so. A lot of eyes have been on the Eagles' big offseason addition in Bryce Huff. He signed a 3-year, $51.1 million deal and has really yet to show up in the box score. He hasn't showed up in the box score. He's had a couple pressures last week. However, really hasn't done a lot in terms of affecting the quarterback. What needs to change in order for the pass rush to be effective tonight?
Yeah, it's funny. Throughout the week, we heard from Nick Sirianni and Vic Fangio about, needing to coach the players better, to put them in better positions to succeed. We heard Vic Fangio talk about that they needed to stop the run in order to, earn the right to rush the passer. After the game, we heard players talk about, needing to rush together, being more, I guess, in sync with each other. But honestly, watching the film back, I think it's really I think it's more simple than that. Like, guys aren't winning their one-on-one matchups. And I guess it's more simple and complicated at the same time, because it isn't always easy to teach somebody just to be better than the man in front of them. But I think that's really what this comes down to. Like, you can talk about, if you're not stopping the run, then you can't rush the passer. But the Eagles struggled to affect Kirk Cousins on that 2-minute drive where it was obvious that is the most known pass situation that you can generate. And in terms of scheme, like, we saw Vic Fangio dial up games and stunts up front. I think he was trying, there were some blitzes in there to just try and generate some pressure. I think at some point it really just comes down to personnel. And, the Eagles have a lot invested in this pass rush. They have a lot of talent per se. You would look at them across the board and expect that those guys could be productive. But for whatever reason, through 2 games, it just has not clicked for this group. And that's really important. I've watched a lot of Eagles football over the last 5 or 6 years, and usually the difference is this defensive line. It's the way the team is built, and honestly, it's just the way that most defenses are successful is by affecting the quarterback. It's something they haven't been able to do, and it's something that if they are going to win this game, they're going to need to affect Derek Carr at some point.
When Brandon Graham is your most dominant edge rusher, something is not right, and that's not to take away from Brandon Graham and his talent. However, there are more prominent younger players among the Eagles' edge rushing core, and they need to step up going into this game. Let's talk a little bit about Nick Sirianni, who has also been scrutinized in the wake of the loss, particularly regarding the decision for the Eagles to go for a field goal, to kick a field goal after a failed 3rd and 3 attempt on their second to last possession of the game. After the fact, Sirianni said that he was even more convicted in his decision in the moment. He went back, reviewed the analytics, looked at teams that had been in similar scenarios, down by a similar amount, up by a similar amount, and ultimately teams that went for the touchdown or went for it on 4th down ultimately lost the game. So he felt more convicted in his decision. What has Sirianni's message been to the team, not only in the wake of that decision in that Falcons game, but also going into this week where this is a really critical moment for this team, even just really early into the season?
Yeah, no, I wrote about this week. Like, this is early adversity for a team that I think is curious. Like, how are they going to respond to adversity? Obviously, the way that last year ended, it seemed like they really couldn't cope with the adversity that they were facing. And I think, again, I think there's a healthy curiosity on how this team will be different, if at all. Nick Sirianni opened the week, talking about kind of blocking out noise and, avoiding scrutiny from, outside voices, whether it's social media comments or, otherwise. He showed some comments about himself that were critical, and then pointed to the fact that it was a 10-year-old that was making those comments. So, don't always lend credence to those things, was his messaging. And I think that that's interesting. It seems like that, again, the team struggled sometimes with the scrutiny last year, the expectations both out internally and externally. So, I think this is going to be, like I said, an early test to see how this team fares against that type of pressure, scrutiny, adversity, whatever you want to call it. We've heard a lot of players talk about responding this week. There's been a lot about how they came into the week and they responded, whether it was through practice. Honestly, none of that really matters. I think that today is going to tell us, how this team responded from the way that they lost last week. It's obviously a tough way to lose. And, again, the expectations are apparent with this team. They are good enough to make it deep into the postseason, but they haven't played that way in their last, 9-10 games. So I do think this is going to be an important test for the team to see kind of how they're wired. And yeah, again, against a good Saints team, a team that's playing really well.
It's going to be a test without A.J. Brown once again. Last week, in Brown's absence, Jalen Hurts had 7 different targets in the passing game, some more than others. No surprise, Devontae Smith was the most heavily targeted of all the receivers. He had 7 receptions for 76 yards and a touchdown. However, after him, there were not as many contributors in the passing game. Dallas Goedert had 3 receptions for 38 yards. Jahan Dotson, who they traded for prior to the start of the season, 1 reception for 6 yards. When you look at some of these, Goddard is a prominent, they always say, Nick Sirianni likes to say that the passing game runs through AJ, Devontae, and Dallas. When it's not running through Dallas and AJ isn't present, and you bring in this piece that you gave up a 3rd-round pick in 2025 for, how important is it for the Eagles to get those 2 players involved in the passing game with Brown out?
Yeah, it's very important. When you watch the Falcons game back, it's apparent that the Eagles didn't have a lot of easy completions for Jalen Hurts. There were, obviously bubble screens to Britton Covey and some underneath routes. But when it came down to actually needing situational football where they actually needed, a positive passing play, there were a handful of times where it looked like the Falcons had it completely covered up, especially in the red zone. It felt like they had that route combination to Saquon Barkley a couple of times. It didn't hit. Obviously hit later in the game, but Saquon dropped the pass. But, it was really apparent how, against the Packers, there were a lot of times where you could see that the scheme, kind of led to easy completions for Jalen Hurts, whether it was the pre-snap motion or the route combinations. And I just didn't think you saw that very much against the Falcons. Maybe that is the absence of A.J. Brown cuts down some of the play sheet, what they can access. But, yeah, I think that in terms of when it comes to Jahan Dotson especially, they traded for him for this type of situation. They wanted somebody who could be a credible number 2 receiver in a pinch. And if they can't figure out how to use him like that, then that really does kind of put the onus on the trade and why, whether it's an evaluation of the player or otherwise. So, yeah, I think it's going to be really important to get them involved. These guys are dynamic players. You've seen it in the past. And I think that they need more of those easy button completions for Jalen Hurts. It can't always be Jalen Hurts rolling out to his right, and trying to find somebody on a scramble drill. So, yeah, I definitely think getting those guys involved in the framework of the offense is going to be really important for the Eagles today.
We will see how Kellen Moore adjusts in today's game. All right, let's head on over to the fan zone. We've got some questions and comments and thoughts from all of you over on Inquirer.com. Let's start with this one from Key Nova. They say that they will know by 4 p.m. on Sunday if the Eagles are tough enough to be a good team this year and perhaps beat a good team as well. You know, EJ, as we already mentioned, it's early in the season. This is some early adversity. They are only 3 weeks into the season. However, how much will we learn about the Eagles and how they're going to perform for the rest of the year in today's game?
Yeah, you know, I think that it's going to be telling on whether or not like some of the, you know, the issues from last year lingered further into this year. I definitely think because like, you know, tough losses are a part of the NFL. Teams lose tough games in the way. Maybe not quite the way the Eagles lost against the Falcons, but there are going to be bumps along the road in every season. I think that the glaring thing about last season that contributed to the collapse is that they just could never seem to get themselves off of the mat. So I do think it's going to be really, really telling to see if they can get themselves off of that proverbial mat today. You know, and again, I keep harping on it. Like the Saints have been one of the best teams in the NFL. I think there's a chance that there's a regression to the mean for both of these teams. You know, I think the Eagles can play a lot better than what they played in the first 2 weeks. I think the Saints have kind of just started the year really hot. So, yeah, I think that it could be a close game. We'll get to predictions later, but I do think it'll be really curious just to see how the Eagles do respond as they kept talking about throughout the week.
Thank you, Key Nova, for your comments. Let's take this one from Jay Malone. They say that the Saints are going to gash this defense. The Eagles are way too reactive on defense. The defense they've had their moments where they're able to bend but not break in the red zone. I think that has been one of the positives. However, they have also, ultimately given up some big chunks, some explosive plays. How do you see the Saints being able to potentially take advantage of some of the Eagles defense's weaknesses through the first 2 weeks of the season?
Yeah, one of the things that the Eagles defense struggled mightily against the Falcons with was outside zone, which is something the Saints do a lot of as well. You know, I've seen a lot of toss plays and outside zone plays to Alvin Kamara. There have been a couple where I watched them back, earlier this week, and I thought, man, the Eagles are going to be really, really terrified of these types of looks, where they'll get their rookie left tackle, Talisi Fuaga, out into space, moving up to the second and third levels, clearing out lanes for Alvin Kamara. They've had a lot of explosive runs in those types of looks. And again, the Eagles have struggled against those looks. So, I to the point of the comment, like about them being reactive, I actually think they need to be a little bit more reactive in terms of like, they have not gone to 5 down fronts. They have not gone to heavy boxes very often against the run. Against the Saints team, like they're an old school team. They will run it down your throat. I think that there are going to be times where they need to go with heavy fronts, odd man fronts, and just try to stop the run, sell out a little bit to stop the run. Vic Fangio said earlier this week that they're not going to have wholesale changes, to the defense after the first 2 weeks, but I don't know if you characterize that as a wholesale change. I mean, I think it's something that they've worked on. I think it's something, again, against the Saints team, they use heavy personnel more than the Falcons or the Packers do. I think the Eagles could go out, use base defense more often, and again, have some more of those odd fronts, load up the box a little bit more, because stopping those outside runs is going to be fundamental to containing this Saints offense.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what adjustments they make. Perhaps Vic Fangio's, what he said earlier this week, maybe a little gamesmanship, maybe a little just trying to keep some things under wraps. We'll see exactly how the defense rolls out to start today's game. All right, EJ, let us get into our player picks for today's game. We've talked about a bunch of different players throughout the show, players that we're going to be keeping our eyes on. However, if you had to just pick one player that you're most interested in seeing how they perform today against the Saints, who would you go with?
I'm going to go with Quinyon Mitchell, just so I can mention Rashid Shaheed again. We've heard Nick Sirianni talk so much about limiting explosive plays and the importance of, winning the explosive play battle and the turnover battle and how that influences winning in general. I mean, if you need to look no further than this wide receiver. Like, he's one of the fastest wide receivers in the league. And I think Quinyon Mitchell is the ideal matchup. Obviously Darius Slay has talked about how fast he is and is a veteran cornerback. But, I mean, Quinyon Mitchell has stuck with guys like Christian Watson this season. I think that, again, if the Eagles can get Quinyon Mitchell matched up and off coverage against Shaheed, I think you like your chances there. But, again, it never ends. It's like a nonstop challenge that he presents to a defense, especially a defense like the Eagles, that really cares about, limiting those explosive plays.
It'd be interesting to see again, like how Mitchell responds after giving up 2 big receptions at the very end of the game that eventually the Falcons went on to score on that touchdown drive, and he took a lot of the blame for that in the aftermath. Fangio has been still very high on his development over the last couple of weeks. We'll see how he's able to handle Shaheed going into today's game. All right, Zach Bond is going to be my player to watch in his quote-unquote homecoming as well. He started his career here with the New Orleans Saints, never really managed to carve out a full-time starter role, and now here he is with the Eagles, the full-time starter alongside Nakobe Dean at inside linebacker. He had a really strong week his first week against the Green Bay Packers. He had 2 sacks, 15 tackles. Last week, 9 tackles against the Falcons, but I don't think that really tells the full story. He struggled throughout the game with cut blocks, and Vic Fangio said this week that this was his first time really dealing with them, and that's, I guess, the growing pains of being a first-time full-time starter at inside linebacker, a position that he's still getting accustomed with as he navigates what it's like to be in that position. So I'm curious to see if the Saints try to attack Bond in a similar way. As you already mentioned, a lot of this, a similar run, similar outside zone scheme that the Saints like to run in the run game. They also like to use a lot of play action too, which can ultimately stress the linebackers as we learned and as we saw against the Green Bay Packers, another team that likes to use a lot of play action too. So I'm very intrigued by how Zach Bond might respond in today's game and how the Saints might try to take a page out of the Falcons book and try to attack him in a similar way. So we'll see exactly how Bond responds. All right. Now, this is my second favorite segment after our fan zone segment. We've got our predictions. We get to put on our thinking caps a little bit and see exactly maybe how the Eagles might fare in terms of the scoreboard and if they'll be able to win this game. And for our first prediction, we bring in our colleague, Jeff McLean. Before Jeff gives us his prediction, I want to know, Jeff, what matchup are you most intrigued by in today's game?
Well, you guys touched upon a lot of them, but my guess is that it would have to be Jalen Hurts, right, versus this defense, and specifically Tyrann Mathieu, who's obviously been around for a long time, very savvy. Maybe doesn't have the work to have, but he that play anywhere on the field, and that's typically what you see. You see how the Saints use him. He'll be in the post, he'll be in the box, he'll play the slot. Mathieu can do a lot, and I think Jalen Hurts has to be very cognizant of where he is where he's on the field. The other safety is Will Harris. He's pretty good as well, and we saw last week pretty good safeties in the Falcons game. And EJ, you brought this up that it seems like when Jalen throws picks, a lot of times it's the savvy safeties. But what I would say about Jalen these first few weeks, though, it's been more on him and the decision making than it has been, I think, on the specific defensive players. Kind of.
All right, Jeff, we'll get you back in here in a moment. But EJ, I want to go to you right now. What is your prediction for today's game?
Yeah, I think that this will be a closer game than maybe the way that these two teams have played in the past would suggest. But I went with the Saints. I think the Saints will win this in a close game. Like I said, I have the Saints winning 31-28. My bigged hangup is the run game and the run defense, the Eagles' run defense in general. I just feel like if they can't, when I watched it back, it wasn't like this is a simple fix that's going to fix their outside zone defense. Like I think that there's a lot there. It's multifaceted. I think it starts with the defensive line just not playing good enough. So it's hard to pick the Eagles to win a game if they can't control it defensively. If the Saints can, run the clock and just dominate the ball with those outside zone runs, I think it's going to be a hard day for the Eagles defense. I think the Eagles offense can put up points against the Saints defense. I think that there is the potential for a turnover or two from Jalen Hurts against, like, as Jeff mentioned, like savvy veteran safeties have seemingly given him trouble in the past. So yeah, I had the Saints winning 31-28. I think it's a winnable game for either team, but yeah, especially on the road, I just kind of favored the Saints matchups in this game.
Understandable. All right, let's give Jeff a shot. We'd like to bring him back and see if we can hear Jeff's prediction. It's good to see you again, Jeff. Welcome
He's back.
If you have any other thoughts about Jalen Hurts, we'd love to hear them. But otherwise, we'd also love to hear your prediction for today's game.
Yeah, I guess I'll finish where I left off. If maybe I got cut off here, but I just think that Hurts obviously has to be better in terms of his decision making. That has been the issue with a lot of these throws. He's, I don't know if it's hero ball or what exactly he's doing. If he doesn't see, he's not seeing it, and he's got to do better of getting off his first reads. And I think it seems like a lot of times when he kind of has to move on to the second and third, he's either panicking, getting flushed out to the right, or scrambling. Now, last week was the first time we've seen him run effectively in quite some time. Hey, if it's there, take it, and that's what Jalen can do with his legs. But I think he's got to be a little more cautious with the ball when he's throwing it downfield. And in terms of my prediction, I'm going against the consensus here. The reason why I'm doing that is because I don't think the Saints are as good as maybe they looked in the first 2 weeks, and I don't think the Eagles are as bad as they looked in the last 2 weeks. Certainly the game against the Falcons. So I have the Eagles winning a close one, 27-23.
All right, regressing to the mean for both teams, as EJ said earlier in our show. All right, I am picking the Saints with a little bit of a wider margin, 34-26. I have the Saints winning. I still, as EJ has mentioned, as you mentioned too, Jeff, I feel like a lot of what the Saints are doing right now have been Achilles heels for the Eagles through the first 2 weeks of the season, particularly magnified in that game against the Falcons, whether it's, stopping the outside zone run, going up against the play action pass, especially with two relatively young, inexperienced inside linebackers in Nakobe Dean and Zach Bond. So this is going to be a big test for the Eagles defense. Offensively, again, I'm not super sold on this this Eagles offense without A.J. Brown and their ability to put up numbers against the Saints defense. I think I'm curious to see how, knowing that Brown and his injury could potentially hold him out earlier in the week, affects the way that the Eagles have been able to prepare and game plan versus him popping up in the middle of the week on the injury report last week. I know that the Eagles have kind of downplayed that throughout the week. They have contingency plans, yada, yada. But I'm curious to see if there is any impact there, and if the Eagles look a little bit more prepared or have a better plan against the Saints defense. So 34-26, as I already mentioned, and we'll see if the Eagles can hang in there against the Saints offense. All right, let's wrap things up for today, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Just as a reminder, head on over to inquirer.com/Eagles Game Day. Throughout the game, I'll be over there hanging out with all of you, answering some of your questions, any thoughts that you have during the game in real time. Looking forward to seeing you over there.
And please keep up with more Eagles coverage on my podcast, Uncovering the Birds. New episodes are being released every week after the games, usually around Tuesday or Wednesday. Listen to wherever you get your podcast, or go to inquirer.com/podcasts. Hopefully we get some more listeners.
All right, everybody. Again, that is all for today. Thanks so much for tuning into Gameday Central. We'll see you next time.